Hey there. So after watching yesterday's screencast, I decided today I would like to talk about my setup and workflow. And the reason for this is I want to head off questions like, what did you do there? And not just head the questions off in the comments, but even head them off in the viewer's mind. I know when I'm watching my favorite screencasters and live coders, I'm often distracted by a tool that they're using that I've never seen before, or a shortcut that they use, and I get very focused on how they did what they did instead of what they're actually working on. So for today, these kind of break down into three topics here: my operating system, my terminal and shell, and my text editor. The first one I'll touch on, and the second two I'm going to go into much more detail and end up kind of bouncing back and forth between the two to give the full explanation. So let's go. First off, let's get rid of this terminal window here, and you can see that this is just a fairly regular looking desktop. This is Linux Mint that I'm running. I used to run Ubuntu, but got turned off by the ironically named Unity windowing system and switched to Linux Mint. Linux, like any other modern operating system, has Windows. This is Chrome. You can watch YouTube. You can browse the web. You can do all kinds of things that you would normally be able to do in, say, Windows or Mac OS X. Moving on to the terminal, I just use the built-in terminal for the version of Linux Mint that I'm using called Mate Terminal, and I run Z shell inside of it instead of Bash, which is typically the default for Unix-like systems. This looks a little different than you probably remember from the previous screencast because I have the font turned up on that, and I also normally have it full screen. This just kind of keeps me from getting distracted and makes the best use of screen real estate, so that's usually how I work. I'll explain the prompt a little bit, but let's change to a different directory. So here we can see that the prompt changed as we changed the directory. Normally, if you've used something like Bash before, you're used to seeing this kind of prompt where you have username at hostname, then the full path to the working directory from the home directory, and then a $sign to kind of show that everything that follows is the commands that you're typing. So if we go back to our Z shell prompt, we see that we don't have the username or the host name, which really just takes up space, in my opinion. I'm on a single login machine that's mine anyway, so I'm just kind of assuming that I am my user at my host. And instead of doing the full working directory path, it just has the directory name for the working directory instead of the entire path to it. Also, my separator, instead of being a $sign, is a Chinese character for to do or to make. My thought initially was that I would write something that would kind of cycle this every time I opened up a shell session, and that would be a way of practicing. I never got around to doing that, so maybe I will do that someday and make a screencast on it. But that's kind of the basics of the prompt. Another thing to note is if we change into a directory that has a Git repository in it, like this one that I created earlier, the prompt changes, and in brackets we have the current branch listed. This is convenient because a lot of times I have a master branch, development branch. I have branches for bug fixes, for features, for different things that I'm trying, and it kind of helps to know where you are. Another convenient thing here about this is if I add a file, there's a little red X that gets dropped in there too to let me know that I have uncommitted changes. If you're not familiar with Git, don't worry about this stuff. I'll kind of touch on it a little bit more later too, but it's not super important. So another question you might have is why Z shell? And there are several reasons. Many of them have to do with convenience. For example, if we look in this directory, we have a message.rb and a to-do file. And if I want to use one of them as an argument, I can hit tab and hit tab again to select the first one, tab again the second, and I can cycle through just by hitting tab. Now if we're trying to do this in bash, we get the completion, but in that it will show us what's in the directory, but it won't actually drop the file name in at the cursor. And another thing that you'll see me do often is this move. And all that I'm doing here is a shortcut for the clear command, which is Control L. And that just clears all of the output and puts the prompt back at the top, so you have more room. Moving on to editing text, I use a text editor called Vim, and Vim has a little bit more of a learning curve than a lot of other text editors. So to just kind of demonstrate equivalently what we're doing, let's imagine that we have a text file named foo. And if you use something like TextMate or Sublime Text before, you might have opened up a file in a text editor that looks like this. We'll type bar in, we'll save, we'll close it, and then if we look at the contents of foo, we see bar inside. So that's editing text, and that should look pretty familiar. With Vim, we can accomplish the same thing by passing foo in as an argument. This will open a file named foo. We can type bar in, save it, close Vim, look inside foo, and there's bar. So this is just to demonstrate that we can accomplish the same thing with Vim, but it looks a little different because it's all taking place in the terminal. But at the end of the day, it's still just a text editor. The thing that makes Vim unique, though, is that it's a modal text editor. Now, when I open up a file and I press keys on the keyboard, I'm not inserting any text. I'm just kind of moving around. I can remove things, I can undo. And that's because I'm in what's called normal mode. And normal mode is so named because it's the mode that you're normally in. If you want to make a change to some text somewhere, though, you will have to drop into insert mode, and then you're free to type, and you can then subsequently jump back out to normal mode and move around, undo things, delete things, undo things, things like that. In addition to the normal mode and insert mode, there's also visual mode, which lets you highlight things. You can highlight lines, you can highlight chunks of text, and this is helpful if you want to, say, indent 2 lines at once, or select 2 lines and delete them, or something like that. So Vim is modal. You've got normal mode for moving around, insert mode for typing things, and visual mode for highlighting things. There are certainly other features of Vim, but these are kind of the basics, and will explain, the bulk of what you will see me do with Vim. In addition to the 3 modes, it's probably helpful to point out that Vim allows you to have what are called multiple buffers, which is basically just allowing you to have several files open at the same time. So let's open our message.rb from before. Let's open our to-do file, and if we do :bn, this runs bnext and lets you go to the next open buffer. We can also see multiple buffers at the same time by doing something like a vertical split, moving over to the other window, and then moving to the next buffer. We can close one of these, move to the next one, move to the previous one, do a horizontal split, move around, move to the next buffer, and then even close all of them and headed out back to the shell. Something else you might see me do frequently is use a plugin called Control P that lets you do what's called a fuzzy lookup on a file name. So I just opened up Control P by hitting Control P, and if I type, say, SA, it will limit this list of files in this directory down to all of the files that match that name. I can hit enter and I open it up. If I hit Control P and type OD, then it does the same thing for to do. So there's quite a few different options in Vim for opening different files, and those are probably the three that I use most commonly. Opening a file straight from the command line, going into Vim and opening a file by name, and going into Vim and opening a file with Control P. And speaking of opening Vim, another thing you'll see me do commonly is this. Now, the reason that this V command works the exact same way as Vim on my machine is because V is alias to Vim. And in the shell, an alias is basically just a shortcut. I've got a number of these, and I'll go into a couple more later, but V is a particularly common one as I'm using Vim all the time. So now that we've talked about the shell and Vim, let's get to kind of my basic workflow. So this is kind of a fake project directory. It's a Git repo. There are 2 files, and this is simplified but pretty representative of how I usually work. Message.rb is basically our business logic for this particular project, and it outputs, this is the first episode of Daily Bits. And if we pop into to do, it points out that we should actually change that to be correct and to say this is the second episode. So I've opened up my to-do list first, and from here I'm going to hit Control Z, and it says, it's got that 1 in brackets on the left, and it says suspended Vim to do, and suspended process is a process that's still running, but it's running in the background. So it's suspended, and we shell out, we return to the shell, and we're able to execute commands here like we would before, and we can jump right back into that Vim process by running the fg foreground command. And we're back in our to-do. Hit Control Z and we suspend it again. And this is how I typically begin with my to-do Vim process. Start it up first and then suspend it in the background. And from here I open up the business logic file or the test or what have you in a second Vim process. And then I'm free to suspend this one, and as you can see, now we've got a 2 out in front of this process for Vim message. And if we hit FG now, we find ourselves right back into the file that we just suspended, and if we hit Control Z again, we suspend back out the same way. So now, if we wanted to switch back to Vim to do, we could do foreground %1. We'd end up back into do. Control Z to suspend. If we just hit foreground straight away now, we'll also end up back in the first process. If we do FG %2, we end up back in message RB. FG brings us right back into that one then. The whole %1 thing was a whole lot of typing for me, and so I created another alias. F1 brings me to the first process, the first suspended process. F2 brings me to the second one. So if you see me suspend and move back and forth between a couple of Vim processes really quickly, that's exactly what I'm doing. Additionally, just to be super lazy, I also have F bound to FG so that I can just run F to jump back into a process. And for rerunning commands that we've run recently, such as the /message_rb, let's say I wanted to rerun that script, I could hit up repeatedly to cycle through. Down cycles back through your commands. Control P and Control N work the same way P and N standing for previous and next. But if you know a command from a while back and it has unique characters in it and you want to run it straight away, you can search for it by a series of characters. So I could hit Control R and do a backwards search through my history for // and hit enter, and we've conveniently run the / message RB without having to cycle back through the entire history. This is really handy. I use this a lot. It looks like this in the shell when you see me do it, but the way I'm pulling this up is Control R, and then I type a couple characters, hit enter, and it executes the command. Additionally, with Control R, if you've typed part of something and want to just keep searching back through your history for that term, you can just hit R over and over again, holding down Control. So let's say I typed F, and I don't want F, I want F2. If I hold down Control and hit R, it will cycle through for all the terms that contain F until I get the one that I want, and I can run it. So having gone through all of that, I find myself in a situation I often find myself in, which is wondering, what were we doing in the first place? To get the answer to this question, I just jump into my first process, go to my undone to do, and realize that we need to make a change to message RB. So I can suspend this process, go into the other one, change first to second, save the file, suspend that, do a backwards search for message, run that, and it's fixed. You'll also notice in my prompt I've got a little X now. If I do a git status S, I can see that that's the message that we just changed, message RB that we just changed. And so if I want to commit this change, I can do git commit -am and then put my message here. This is a whole lot of typing to do for something as common as committing. So as you might guess, I have this alias to C, which stands for commit. So I will do a commit, updated episode number, commit, and our X goes away, and our mission is accomplished. So that covers my basic setup and my workflow using Z Shell, Vim, and a handful of aliases and shortcuts that I use. In the show notes below, I will add a link to my .files, and inside of that I have a list of all my aliases in case you're interested. You can find all of my Vim config in there as well. And in case you're interested in installing Z Shell yourself, I recommend the Railscast on the subject, and I will also put a link to that in the show notes. And that's it. Please let me know in the comments below if you have any questions, and I will see you tomorrow. And just in case you're wondering why I don't have something as long as git status -s aliased, I do.